Chapter 5 Naomi. 3 in the morning came and went, and still Naomi couldn't sleep. She tossed and turned in her bed, ending up in a tangle of sheets that she couldn't straighten out before she finally fought her way out of the mess and sat up. Everything around her was completely quiet. Not even the crickets outside her window were chirping. For the first time in her life, Naomi truly understood what a deafening silence was. She combed her hand through her hair and tugged at the roots, feeling the dull ache adding to her already heavy mood. Ever since Rex and Alan had left her house that afternoon, she hadn't been able to shake herself out of it. Even another cup of hot chocolate hadn't helped. She couldn't settle down long enough to watch a movie either, so in the end she had decided to go on a run. That was another advantage of living this far away from everyone. She could do what she wanted when she wanted, without having to deal with snide whispers and sidelong glances. Once outside, she had decided that a jog was going to do exactly nothing for her mood and had broken into a sprint. It was heaven, the landscape whizzing past around her, her mind on one thing, and one thing only, complete and utter exhaustion. She could feel the muscles in her legs and her back working, burning from the exertion, and she loved it. She had run full tilt all the way round the farm twice before finally collapsing in a panting, heaving mess on the front porch. Her heart had been beating almost through her chest, and she'd been soaked in sweat, making the cold fall air cut that much sharper into her skin. But the relief had ended as soon as she'd stepped out of the shower. Even as she had dried her hair, she could feel that fog descending again, wrapping her up in a blanket of anger and melancholy. She still hadn't been able to figure out what the problem was. Naomi sat up straighter in bed, turned on the light, and got a piece of paper and pen from her nightstand. She was going to make a list. That always helped, didn't it? Number 1, Andre. But by all accounts, life in Sanguine was quiet and peaceful, and there was nothing to worry about. Number 2, the farm. Nothing there. Everything was going even better than she could have hoped when she bought the old place. Number 3. The piece of paper in front of her stared right back at her. She tried to logic her way out of her anger, but it didn't work. She hadn't felt this way in a long time, and it was making her crazy. Naomi sighed and put the paper away. There was nothing for it now, except trying to distract herself. She got up and got dressed, opting for warmth over style. In an old pair of thick jeans and an oversized sweater, she went down to the living room. Her senses were still as sharp as they had been yesterday, except that another feeling had been added. She felt like she was waiting for something, an attack, something. But for all of that, she felt like she was trying to wade through honey. Her body was operating entirely on instinct, her ears listening for any unusual sounds, and her brain struggling to make sense of the soup of emotions that was flooding through her. She hated feeling like this. She was pouring herself a cup of coffee when suddenly a memory washed over her. She was 15 years old. It was the middle of the night, and she hadn't been able to sleep. Something kept pulling her awake every time her eyes had tried to shut. There had been sounds coming from downstairs, but she hadn't been able to hear what was going on. She'd heard the scraping of a chair on the floor, and without knowing how, she'd known that something terrible was happening down there. She had wanted to go downstairs and see, but was too scared. When she'd come downstairs in the morning, her father hadn't been around. He hadn't come back for 3 days, scraped up, beaten, bloody. He'd sat at the kitchen table and cried like a baby, and somewhere deep inside, Naomi felt that if she had gone down that night, if she'd done something, he might be all right now. She hadn't thought of that memory in years. She didn't generally believe in holding on to bad times, and it hit her like a truck. That night, her instinct had clearly picked up something she hadn't really understood yet. Maybe it was the same this time. Naomi shook her head and drank the rest of the coffee, feeling the bitter burning as it went down her throat. Maybe it wasn't anything like that this time. The rest of the day crawled by as she paced, fretted, and tried to think up chores for herself. By the time it was dark, Naomi had worked herself into a nice good tizzy. But still, the feeling that something was awfully heavy on her stomach. She finally went to bed, even though she knew she wasn't going to be able to sleep. It felt like the morning was never going to come. By the time the sun's rays finally made their way over the horizon and in through Naomi's bedroom window, she was fuming and exhausted. She hadn't slept a wink, and all the turning and tossing had worn her out. She threw the covers onto the floor, got dressed as quickly as she could, pulled on her boots and went outside. If she couldn't sleep, she could at least get a jump on her chores. She grabbed the bucket of chicken feed and started towards the coop. There was a little bit of a breeze in the air, and she turned her face so she could feel better. She took a deep, calming breath, hoping it might settle her stomach, which helped some. She looked around her land. The farm wasn't big by any means, but it was large enough to fulfill the demand for her products. But looking at it now, at the space around her with the woods on one side, the road on the other, and the empty fields stretching out everywhere else, she suddenly felt vulnerable, exposed. She turned her face up and sniffed at the air. She'd always had a keen sense of smell, even in her human form. She could smell something out there, something different from usual, but her nose gave her no clues as to what it could be. Naomi thought back to Rex and Alan's proposition. Joining the pack would give her the protection she didn't have out here. The house was wired up, of course. Allie had insisted on making sure Naomi got a real security company to come out and secure the house, but putting a security fence around the property would have cost more than Naomi was worth, so she had settled for a normal wire fence. Allie had objected loudly, but Naomi had ignored her and gone ahead with it. Standing out here now, though, she thought that may have been a mistake. Trouble could come from anywhere. She was alone out here. If Andre decided that she was to blame for Allie's defection, something might happen to her and help wouldn't get here until it was too late. In case of any incoming threats, Rex's first priority would be to secure his pack. The loner on the edge of town would have no protection. When she first got here, she thought of joining a pack as a burden, as something that would get in the way of her living the life she wanted to live. She would have to participate in the traditions and the rituals. She'd have to give up the freedom she had during the full moon. As it was, she could transform as she wanted, without having to share her night with her age mates. In the pack, she could run, she could growl and scream and just be. She couldn't have that. If she couldn't have the freedom to transform on her own terms, why would she tie herself to what she thought was an outdated institution? Naomi stood back and watched as the chicken pecked at the feed she had scattered on the ground for them, her thoughts racing. Maybe it was time to officially join, to put herself under the blanket of protection offered by an alpha. After all, Rex was not the same kind of leader she'd seen all her life. He actually listened to people. He didn't hold them to outdated traditions, and he didn't force people to be something they didn't want to be. He'd even given Ben the freedom to go rescue Allie from her own father. Interfering in the matters of another pack like that was extremely unusual, and here was a man who didn't think twice about it if it meant helping someone. All her life, Naomi had gone through upheaval. There were very few things she could count on to be solid, to always be there. Her friendship with Allie was one of them, and her conviction that she could take care of herself was the other. Other than that, growing up in Sanguine had not given her much stability or the feeling of a safe, warm home. The alpha before Nicholas had been a man named Ivan Volkov, a vicious, bloodthirsty man whose biggest obsessions were to acquire more territory and to control his pack by any means necessary. Was not the ideal environment for children to grow up in. There was a lot of sneaking around and coming home after the town curfew, and Naomi and her brother had learned some very valuable lessons about being stealthy. But most of all, they'd learned that the authority figures in their lives couldn't be trusted. Ivan Volkov had bred an atmosphere of fear and distrust in Sanguine, and everyone had bent over backwards to try to deal with the unpredictability of their leader. Nicholas hadn't been much different, encouraging the families to teach their children absolute obedience and loyalty to the pack. In Naomi's case, this had meant that her father had tried to turn her and her brother into the ideal children by force if needed. Eventually, Naomi's brother couldn't take it anymore and had left the pack, leaving no word of where he had gone. Allie had fared better. She was almost chameleon-like, able to do whatever her father wanted her to do at one moment and reverting back into her real self when his back was turned. The children in Fell, though, they were different. Naomi saw them when she went into town, congregating in large huddles in the store once school was out, chatting and giggling amongst themselves. Boys and girls of a certain age, usually kept to groups of their own gender, but once in a while a teenaged couple would wander through town, holding hands and whispering to each other. It was sweet, and every time she saw them, Naomi would smile in spite of herself. They were so free, these children, so able to be open in themselves. And sometimes she'd feel a twinge of pain for the children she and Allie had been, the selves they had to hide from their parents who didn't want to risk the wrath of an unstable alpha. Naomi finished the rest of her chores as quickly as she could, only letting herself think about the tasks at hand, the cleaning, hosing down the cobbles outside the barn, mucking out the hay, feeding the animals, and working on the flower beds and the plants. Her head was almost spinning with exhaustion by the time she got home, but she already knew what she was going to do next. She washed up and got changed, then dialed Allie's number before she remembered that most people would still be asleep at 8 in the morning on a Saturday. Talking to Allie was the only way things seemed real to Naomi. Allie had been the first one Naomi had called when she got into college, the first one she had called when her mother died, and the first one she had called when she had decided to cut her waist-length hair off back in the 10th grade. "Hey, Nay," groaned Allie, her voice still rough with sleep. "Everything okay?" "Why is that your first question when I call you?" asked Naomi. Her spirit already felt lighter. Hearing Allie's voice always had that effect on her. "Because you live on your own in the middle of nowhere, and because you drive like a maniac anytime you're behind the wheel of something that isn't your truck. I live in dread of the day I get the call that you're hurt," explained Allie. "Now why are you calling me at the crack of dawn?" "Firstly, it isn't the crack of dawn. And secondly, I needed to talk to you about something." "What's wrong?" asked Allie, her voice suddenly clear. "Nothing's wrong. I just decided that maybe I want to officially join the pack." Naomi held her breath, waiting for Allie's reaction. There was silence on the other end of the line for a few moments. "Are you sure?" Allie finally asked. "Yeah. I've been thinking about it for a while, and I mean, why put it off, right? What do you think?" "I think that's really great, Nay. I'm just surprised. I don't know if I'm necessarily all the way awake at the moment." Naomi smiled to herself. Allie had never really been a morning person. She'd always gotten up early because it was expected, but if she had it her way, she'd stay in bed until noon at least. "Fine. Go back to sleep. I'll call you later after I talk to Rex. I assume he doesn't live to sleep like some people." Allie made a noise of outrage. "I do not live to sleep, but I will let it go. Because you just made a life-altering decision, and I'm really happy for you. I'll come to see you later. Just text me what time you're free." They got off the phone, and for the first time in a long time Naomi felt hopeful. Ever since she'd come to Fell, part of her had been waiting for the other shoes to drop, for Andre Galkin to turn his rage on the Fell pack in return for robbing him of his daughter. But now, for the first time in a long time, even though she was still on edge and even though the last days had been terrible, she felt actual hope. Her flight from Sanguine had been an act of self-preservation more than a matter of desperation, and now she was going to finally belong to something that no one could take away from her. She settled on the couch, trying to think of a way to pass the time before she called Rex. For all her bravado with Allie, Naomi wouldn't have dared to call him at such an early hour. Alphas were not to be disturbed before 10 a.m. at least, she thought. Luckily, the sheep chose that moment to start shouting and making a fuss. One of them had managed to get tangled up in the wire fencing around the property, and luckily the only damage was to his pride, but it took Naomi a good 20 minutes to get him freed and calm and back with his friends. By the time she was finished, it was sufficiently late enough to call Rex. She washed her hands as thoroughly as she could, tied her hair back in a tight ponytail, and sat in the kitchen with a cup of coffee. In her stomach, the butterflies were going crazy, and the coffee did nothing to calm them. She was about to join a pack again, and she had to admit that there was something exciting and positive about it. She could be with Allie during the full moon again, so that their wolves could play around like they used to when they were little. And if Andre Galkin decided that he wanted to start trouble, she could actually be of use to Rex and Alan, and they would protect her. She took a deep breath, picked up the phone, and dialed. Chapter 6. John. It seemed like an eternity crawled by before Rex Blake left Fell for long enough to let John and Dimitri finally put their plan into action. John spent that time so on edge that he was surprised he hadn't ground every single one of his teeth to a nub. He tried to help out the rest of the team to keep him occupied, but they had their own projects to work on and were very secretive about it. It was very unusual that the team was working on multiple projects. Dimitri's method for choosing jobs was legendary among the team. If a job didn't interest him, he wouldn't take it no matter the money offered or the seniority of the wolf who was asking. Dimitri's work mostly came from the sanguine alphas, but he was known to work for different packs too. As long as the job was fun, he'd do it. Dimitri had one rule though, no matter how fun a job was, he only took one job at a time, preferring to give his undivided attention to whatever he was doing. It was unheard of for him to take two jobs on at the same time. But this time it was different. The compound had been buzzing for months. The other wolves on Dimitri's team hadn't told John what it was that they were doing, so one afternoon, when John and Harry found themselves in the kitchen together having a cup of coffee, John took his chance. "Hey Harry, what are you guys working on? Did Dimitri take on another job?" Harry nodded, keeping his eyes squarely on his cup of coffee. John tried again. "Do you guys need help? What are you working on?" Harry scowled at him. "If you're not on the job, you don't need to know." Harry went back to drinking his coffee in silence. Downtime was precious, and John knew that Harry was determined to enjoy every drop to the fullest. Dimitri didn't like his people to have a lot of time to themselves, he said it created laziness. When John was younger and things would get quiet, Dimitri would give him chores like cleaning the bathroom with a toothbrush and bleach, or polishing every gun in the armory. John used to resent it, wonder why he wasn't allowed to go outside and play with the other kids in the village, but in time he had come to understand and respect what Dimitri was trying to teach him. Harry was a friendly man when he wasn't working. As the oldest person on the team, he'd taken the other team members under his wing when they first came to the compound, but he wasn't any easier on them than Dimitri was. The biggest difference was that Harry would explain the rationale behind his actions. Sometimes, when he wanted to. Finally, maybe because he took pity on the curious young wolf, or because he wanted to talk to someone, Harry said, "He's working us into the ground. At least your job is close to home. We have to do a surveillance thing in San Francisco." "For what pack?" asked John. He couldn't help himself. Harry raised an eyebrow. "I can't tell you that, and you know it." Confidentiality was very important. Even if it was Andre who assigned the surveillance job, John would likely never know. Harry went over to the sink to rinse out his cup and then leaned on the sink. "How's your job coming along?" "It's not bad," replied John. "We're just waiting for an opening to go in and get the target. Other than that, everything's ready and waiting. Don't let anything slip through the cracks. This one seems to be important to Dimitri," said Harry as he walked out of the kitchen. Harry was right. Over the last few weeks, Dimitri had been paying more attention to this job than the others. He'd also started to get more moody and secretive. He'd even punched Harry for daring to ask if they could postpone one of the jobs until everything else was completed. Harry had been thrown clear across the room from the force. Whatever the girl represented to Andre, she meant something to Dimitri too. John just kept his head down and went about his work. He'd managed to stay out of Dimitri's way so far. He'd also taken over communications with Andre's people. Andre had posted spies around the edge of Fell, keeping an eye on the comings and goings of the Alpha and the Elders. Naomi Grimes rarely changed her routine, keeping the same schedule on most days. The most she deviated was when Alexandra, Andre's daughter, and her fiancé, some fell wolf, came to visit her on the farm, or when she went into town to see them. Rex and Alan had visited a couple of times as well, but for the most part she was on her own all day every day. The only problem was that Rex hadn't left town at all lately. Dimitri had hurled a glass at the wall when John had brought him the latest report. "Why is he still there?" Dimitri had bellowed. John had looked right ahead, trying not to make eye contact with his enraged boss. "If he doesn't leave soon, we're going in there anyway," Dimitri had growled. He had strode across the room, getting right up in John's face. "Be ready." But then the morning came when good news finally arrived. Rex and his wife and kid had loaded up the car for a short weekend away at a little lodge down the coast. The spies reported that they weren't expected to be back until tomorrow morning, which meant that there was plenty of time to get Naomi and get out. Dimitri almost cheered when John told him the news. "Excellent," he crowed in. A rare display of emotion. "Get everything ready. We're going to get her today. No more putting it off." John just nodded and hurried out of the room. Whatever Naomi Grimes had done to piss off a man like Dimitri, John was better off not knowing. When Dimitri was in a bad mood, he was at least easy to understand. He would yell and shout and hit people, and afterwards he would calm down and get back to normal. But in the last couple of weeks, his moods had bordered on unstable, pensive one moment, raging the next moment, depressed silence not long afterwards. Everyone was walking on eggshells around him, trying not to set him off. As John packed the equipment into the van, he started going over the plan in his head again. There was a back road that led right to the farm, cut through the far side of the forest that surrounded Fell. No one would see them if they drove through there. Naomi hadn't bothered to install an electric fence or anything, so getting on the actual property wouldn't be a problem at all. The only thing that could pose a challenge was the security system she had for her house, but John knew that it was only turned on at night, so their best bet was to take her during the day. It was a risk, of course, but if they got her when she was already outside, they could reduce any traces that they'd been there at all. John smiled to himself. Only Dimitri would be bold enough to kidnap someone in broad daylight on a rival pack's land, no less. John sent a quick prayer to anyone who was listening that there wouldn't be any setbacks that might force Dimitri to turn his anger on his protégé. Half an hour later, they were in the van on their way to Fell. Fall was in full swing, and the leaves on the trees had turned a cacophony of browns, reds and yellows. It was a beautiful scene, but John didn't pay much attention to it. His stomach was in knots. Planning a kidnapping on a day as beautiful as this seemed wrong, but John kept driving. Dimitri was in the passenger seat, smoking cigarette after cigarette, the smell wafting through the car towards John, who tried to ignore it. Any normal human being, and any normal wolf for that matter, would have died from that amount of nicotine a long time ago, but not Dimitri. Somehow the level of abuse he put his body through did not leave marks. It was just another piece of the mystery. The route they'd chosen was an hour longer than the normal one to Fell and went over unfinished roads. John tried to focus on not rolling the van over, instead of on the uncomfortable feeling in his stomach. "Are you sulking again, puppy?" asked Dimitri. He deliberately blew a mouthful of cigarette smoke right at John. "Not at all, sir," John replied. "Just trying to focus on the road." Dimitri grinned. "Good pup. Keep your wits about you. I don't want anything to ruin this." John felt his ears perk up at that last sentence, almost unconsciously. He felt a question on the tip of his tongue and stopped himself from speaking. It wasn't his place to know. He just drove right on to Naomi's farm, trying to keep his nerves at bay. They finally made it to the appointed place and parked their van in a little clearing just behind what looked like a barn. The space was open enough so that they could drive away fairly quickly, yet hidden enough by a group of trees that blocked them from sight. It was upwind of the farmhouse, so even if Naomi was in there, she'd never be able to smell them. John wasn't taking any more risks than necessary here. Everything was completely still. There was no sign of life. Some animal noises were coming from the barn, but John tuned those out and tried to listen beyond them. He heard nothing. The wind rustled gently through the trees and the plants on Naomi's fields, but there was no sign of movement anywhere. John and Dimitri hunkered down beside the van and settled in to wait. If the information they'd received was accurate, Naomi would come out before sunset to put the animals away. It took about half an hour before there was any sign of life from the house. John's ears noticed it before he did, perking up like something was pulling at them to get them to turn. John looked up with a start. It was her. She was just coming out of the door, a bucket in her hands, wearing a thick sweater. She was quite attractive. Flame red hair tied up in a practical ponytail, tall and strong-looking. She wouldn't be any match for them, of course, but she'd put up one hell of a fight. John patted his pocket for the folding baton he'd stashed in there and stroked the cool hard plastic like an amulet. He was prepared for her to fight back. John felt Dimitri tense beside him and held a hand out to remind his boss to stay down. John could smell the impatience and rage coming in waves off Dimitri, and he hoped against hope that Naomi wouldn't smell it too. Adrenaline coursed through his body as he watched her walk towards the barn. He couldn't see what she did there, but from the noises he guessed she was feeding the chickens and shooing them back into the henhouse for the night. Dimitri growled, a low rumbling sound just loud enough for John to hear. John turned to his mentor and shook his head. It was obvious that Dimitri wanted to take her now, but that was not how they'd planned it. The more things were left in disarray, the more suspicious it would look. Time wasn't passing like normal while they were waiting. Watching Naomi do her chores, it felt like time was whizzing by, a minute feeling like an hour. Naomi finished her chores in the barn and the henhouse and swept up some stray chicken feed from the ground. John watched her closely. Didn't seem like she'd noticed that anything was wrong, and he thanked whoever was listening. Naomi walked into the open courtyard while picking pieces of lint off her outfit and brushing them off her hands. The sun hadn't gone down yet, but the first orange-yellow rays of sunset were starting to cast themselves over the courtyard. They had to take her at the right moment before she got back to the house and turned on the alarm. John watched her pause, pick at a leaf on a tall, slightly wilted sunflower, and tensed his body to make his move. Suddenly she stopped dead still. Her head turned upwards, searching for something John couldn't see. His heart dropped. She wasn't searching. She was sniffing. She'd caught a whiff of them somehow, and she knew she wasn't alone. He watched in horror as she made that connection and looked desperately around her, trying to see which way the danger was coming from. She started running, her long legs covering the distance to her house at an alarming speed. There was nothing for it now. John launched himself into a run, the crouched position he'd been holding catapulting him towards her. He heard Dimitri do the same behind him. The two men sprinted towards Naomi. She must have heard them coming now because she ran faster, stretching her legs into a huge stride that only wolves could manage. John reached her first, jumped on top of her and tackled her to the ground. She flailed and struggled, and it took a couple of seconds for John to realize that she'd caught the side of his face with a fully transformed claw. Dimitri came up behind him and helped him hold her down. If they let her transform, things could get messy. The two men struggled to stay on top of Naomi as she bucked and tried to roll over. Dimitri held her arms to the side, but even with his strength she was proving to be a tough adversary. John reached into his pocket, drew out the baton, and drove it into the back of her head with as much force as he could muster. She fell still, blood dripping from the cut on her head where John had hit her. Dimitri collapsed beside her, panting. John put 2 fingers to her neck and felt a pulse. Good. The deal had been to deliver her alive. He nodded to Dimitri before he collapsed onto the ground too, trying to catch his breath. Their only advantage had been that they had taken her by surprise. If she'd known they were coming, they wouldn't have got her. John didn't know how he felt about that, knowing how long he'd spent preparing and studying for this job. The two men looked around them. It was getting late and they needed to be gone as soon as possible. There was no sign of their struggle with Naomi other than some scuffs in the dirt. Good job, puppy. Dimitri hauled himself up and hoisted Naomi over his shoulder like a sack of grain before he offered a hand to help John to his feet. Let's get going before it gets dark. John opened the back of the van and helped Dimitri dump her into it. They tied her hands with duct tape and placed a bag over her head. There was no sense in taking the chance that she'd wake up and start kicking up a fuss halfway back to Andrei's cabin. Far from being horrified, Dimitri looked positively delighted by the sight of the woman lying in a mass on the floor of the van. Shouldn't we make sure she's okay or something? Or bandage her up? Asked John. Dimitri shrugged as he got back in the car. She'll be fine. At least she'll be fit for Andrei's purposes. John's heart was in his mouth. He'd done it. He'd actually done it. But as they drove back the same way they'd come, he could feel a small part of him, part that Dimitri hadn't yet suffocated, screaming with remorse. He'd hurt her, he'd hit her in the head. What if he'd given her a serious injury? He looked down at his hands on the wheel. There was blood smeared on them and, as he wiped them on his pants, he knew it wasn't his. Chapter 7. Naomi. Despite Naomi's nervousness for her call with Rex, it went very well. When she told Rex that she decided to make her membership of the Fell Pack official, he was very happy with her decision, gushing over her with a pride that she hadn't had associated with her in a long time. Naomi, you're making the right decision, Rex said. You're going to be an asset to our pack. And once you're officially one of us, we can protect you and utilize your talents in the right way. She blushed a little when she heard the happiness in his voice. I'll call everyone and set it up. She thanked him, said her goodbyes, and hung up. The butterflies in her stomach flapped up a storm. She knew that this was the right decision and she was happy that she'd finally be a part of the Fell Pack. But over the next couple of weeks, she found herself becoming more and more nervous. Binding herself to a new pack was a huge deal. When her family had moved to Sanguine from Florida, she and her brother had been too young to go through the ceremony, so they'd been treated like children born into the pack. But she'd heard stories of others who had gone through an initiation ritual that bound them to their new pack. The alpha did some kind of magic that would kill a wolf if it even thought of betraying its pack. It was an ancient kind of magic, and Naomi couldn't help but feel scared of it. What made it worse was that no one would tell her anything about the fell initiation ritual. Of course there were some stories floating around, but no one besides the elders and Allie, who'd gone through it, knew what happened at the ceremony, and they weren't talking. Naomi hated surprises with a passion, ever since her 5th birthday party when a clown had popped out of the kitchen and scared the living daylights out of her. Her whole body was rebelling against the idea of going into the ritual. Completely blind. Her stomach was a wreck, her mind was unfocused, and it was all she could do to keep to her regular schedule. Finally, about a week after she called Rex, she decided that there was only one thing for it: begging. She went to visit Allie at the store, hoping that maybe if her best friend saw exactly how desperate she was, she'd be merciful. Come on, ALS. Alan won't tell me, and you're my best friend. Give me something, please. But Allie shook her head and kept going with her paperwork while Ben guffawed. From the other side of the office, Naomi glared at him, hoping that she could make his computer explode with a single look. Nay, I can't tell you anything. It's a secret for a reason. You have to trust that everything's going to fine, said Allie, pointedly avoiding eye contact. Ben chimed in. She's right, you know. I'm sure there's a reason why they don't let people talk about it. Besides, Allie couldn't even if she wanted to. Naomi scowled at him. My deepest thanks to the peanut gallery, but we do not need the input. Ben made a face at her before turning back to his own work, leaving the two women to talk. Nay, I promise it isn't as bad as you think it is. You just have to try and relax. There isn't that much time left before your ceremony anyway, so you'll know soon. Allie came round the desk and wrapped an arm around Naomi, patting her shoulder soothingly. Naomi dropped the issue, settling for going to lunch with Ben and Allie instead, but she couldn't put it out of her mind. Eventually the nightmares started. One of them involved Nicholas and Andre showing up at the ceremony, Andre with a wild look in his eyes and Nicholas with his face half-rotted rising from his grave, grinning through the hole in his cheek as he beckoned for her to come home. But the ones that stuck with her the most involved her embarrassing herself in a way that only Naomi Grimes could, and being chased from the ceremony and the village in shame. The thought stuck in her head, playing on an endless loop, an image of herself falling or stumbling over her words, and Rex's disappointed face as he realized that he'd backed the wrong person kept reappearing no matter how much she tried to repress it. Soon the only way to calm herself was doing hard core yard work. Something about violently yanking weeds and leftover roots out of the ground soothed her. On the plus side, her garden and her fields had never looked better. One afternoon when she and Allie were getting coffee, Naomi opened up about what she'd been going through. Maybe you've got cold feet, Allie suggested as she sipped her coffee. She watched Naomi carefully, although to her credit she did try to hide it with a casual smile. Still, Naomi smarted under the scrutiny. Of course I don't have cold feet, she replied. I'm just nervous about the ceremony. Rex is taking such a big risk on me. What if I do something wrong? Naomi, Rex isn't actually taking that big of a risk because he already knows that you're going to be an asset to the pack. You're smart, loyal, brave, and strong. You're everything he needs in his pack. You're completely risk-free. For him. Naomi nodded, but she was unconvinced. He's done everything for me. What if I mess up somehow? Like what if I trip and fall flat on my face? Or if I mess up the words or the ceremony, and I make him and Alan look bad? Allie laughed. You're not going to trip and fall, I promise. And there's no way you could mess up the ceremony. Rex and Alan will be right there with you. And they'll walk you through everything. Now you have to let this go. You're going to make yourself sick. How do you know it's going to be fine? Naomi replied, hating how shrill her voice sounded in her own ears. I'm not the most coordinated person in the world, you know. You're the most graceful person I know, said Allie, patting Naomi on the hand. You don't have anything to worry about. You just have to put it out of Your mind. Naomi couldn't quite put her finger on it, but there was something in Allie's voice, or perhaps it was Allie's hand on hers, that reassured her, that put her mind to ease. It was the effect that her best friend had on her. She gave Allie a hug, and as Naomi walked back to her car, she took a few deep breaths, savoring the crisp, fresh air. Allie had gone through the ceremony, and if she wasn't worried, then why should Naomi? When Naomi woke up the next morning, it felt like something had changed in the world. The sun felt warmer, the bird song outside her window sounded sweeter, and the colors around her seemed brighter. For the first time in a long time, she felt rested and refreshed. She smiled to herself as she lay in bed, contemplating how long the chickens and the sheep could stand to go without their breakfast. Her bed felt more comfortable than it had in a long time, and she just didn't want to leave. As she stared at the ceiling, her face broke into a satisfied smile. She realized that her stomach was actually settled. The anxiety that had been her constant companion since the day Rex and Alan had come to visit her was no longer there. The world seemed like it was new. It was the first time in years that everything was falling into place. Naomi gave herself 10 more minutes in bed before she got up. There were animals waiting to be fed and let outside, and weeds to be dug out of her flower beds, and she couldn't tarry much longer. Normally, she tried to get through her chores as quickly as possible, but this morning she wanted to enjoy them. She strolled outside, bundled up against the cold, and started feeding the chickens and the sheep, watching them go about their breakfast with an interest she hadn't had since she first bought the farm. She swept up the yard and then got down to preparing the soil in the flower beds for the winter. It was getting cold and fell. Soon everyone would be getting ready for Thanksgiving, Halloween, and then Christmas. Naomi had planted some pumpkins when the weather started to get warmer, and they were getting ripe. She knelt and rapped on one with her knuckles. They'd keep for another couple of days, and then she could take them into town for Allie and Ben to sell. Once everything was done, she went inside to take a hot shower. There wasn't much left to be done. In her nervous haze of the last few weeks, she'd done most of the things she needed to do for the changing season, so now she could sit back, have some breakfast, watch a movie, and relax. She smiled to herself. Old Naomi would never have done something like that. Even just a month ago, she'd have found something new to obsess over, and she'd have driven herself completely crazy over it. Truth be told, she really enjoyed doing absolutely nothing, sitting back on her couch, the movie playing as background noise as she drifted in and out of sleep. She realized that she could really get used to this. The alarm on her phone jolted her out of her relaxed reverie when the sun was going down. It was getting colder and colder, and she needed to get the animals fed and into their shelters for the night. She yawned as she got up and put her boots on. Her muscles felt like butter. All the tension had flowed out of her body. The light of the sunset was bouncing off the red, yellow, and brown leaves on the trees. It was beautiful out here. There was no other way to describe it. Everything seemed right with the world. She picked up the bucket of feed she'd prepared for the animals and headed for the yard. But just as Naomi stepped into the yard, something in the air changed. The hairs on the back of her neck stood at attention, and her ears ached with that unique alert feeling that signaled danger on the horizon. She looked around. There was nothing in the yard that wasn't supposed to be there. The orange light from the sunset reflected from the trough of water she kept topped up for the animals, and she shaded her eyes from the glare. She stood still for a moment, her eyes scanning the landscape for anything out of the ordinary, before she turned back to her task. She fed the animals and herded them back inside for the night, and as she walked back, she swept up some chicken feed from the ground, picked some stray pieces of lint off her outfit, and brushed them off her hands. The sun hadn't completely set yet, and she took a moment to enjoy the orange-yellow rays lighting up the yard. It was almost like a fairy tale in its beauty and simplicity. As she stood, she thought of what she had left to do for the night. Thankfully, it was nothing more than going inside, having dinner, and going to bed. Maybe she could catch up on some reading or something. She stopped at one of the flower beds. The sunflowers had grown tall this year, but now that the seasons were starting to turn, they were starting to droop a little. She picked a dead leaf off the tallest one and flicked it onto the ground. Soon there wouldn't be flowers at all. It was going to be her first winter on the farm, and she wondered distantly how she was going to deal with it, losing herself mentally in lists of the things she'd need to buy or repair. before the first snowfall. Suddenly, something caught her attention. There was a strange smell on the breeze, something familiar, but she couldn't place it. She turned her head upward, sniffing at the air. A memory woke up in the back of her mind. She took another deep breath, and her heart dropped into her stomach. Someone was watching her. A wolf was watching her. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to get the hell out of there now. She frantically turned her head this way and that, but all she could detect was that smell in the air, that smell of rage and danger. Her whole body burned as the blood started to rush through her. She started to run towards the house. Whatever was out there waiting for her, she wasn't going to wait to find out. Her muscles burned as she ran, her legs pounding the ground as hard as they could. Each breath tore desperately out of her lungs. Her whole body was trembling like a leaf. All of a sudden her ears picked up the sound of footsteps behind her, heavy boots pounding at the ground as they chased after her. She chanced a glance over her shoulder, and her heart almost stopped. 2 men, one older, one younger. She turned back, focusing all her attention on the house. She had to make it. She put everything out of her mind except for that one thought. The house. She had to get to the house. She stretched her legs as much as she could, willing her stride to get as long as possible. Every animal instinct fighting for the survival that these men would surely deny her. One of them tackled her from behind, and she went down like a sack of potatoes. All the air was knocked out of her body. She struggled and fought, willing all the strength of her body into her arms and legs as she kicked at the man on top of her. He was so heavy, so impossibly heavy. Her only chance was to transform, and she started to will herself to. Adrenaline flooded through her body. Her fingers elongated and changed into razor-sharp claws, and she lashed out in every direction. The man was on top of her, forcing her face down to the ground, and she strained and writhed, catching his face with her claw. She couldn't get enough air to shift. She could smell the blood from the man's face, and a little thrill ran down her spine at the thought that she'd hurt him. The metallic iron blood smell revitalized her. She heard distant footsteps behind them. An iron grip closed around her ankles and held her down. She couldn't get enough momentum to kick back at either of them. She pulled from every reserve of strength she had and bucked as hard as she could. The one sitting on her back wasn't fighting back, leaving his partner to deal with holding her down. Then there was a burst of intense pain. Lights flashed in front of her eyes, and everything went. Chapter 8. Allie. Do you think she'll like it? Asked Allie. She fidgeted with the label on the bottle of wine she was holding. The bottle she bought was a little more expensive than what she usually got, but it was a special occasion after all. Ben grinned at her from the driver's seat. What are you worried about? I've yet to meet the bottle of wine that Naomi Grimes will turn down. Allie swatted at him but smiled. They were driving down the winding road to Naomi's farm. The last few weeks had been challenging for her best friend. What with the changing seasons and the preparation for the binding ceremony to officially join the pack. In the year that Naomi had been living in Fell, she and Allie hadn't talked as often as they had when they were still in Sanguine. Back then they'd been everything to each other, the only touchstone in a society that wanted them to be something they weren't. They'd known each other since childhood, and over the years they'd developed almost a second sense about when something was wrong with the other. But now that everything had fallen into place for both of them, it seemed like life was forcing them apart. Naomi was busy with the farm, seemingly achieving the impossible. She'd turned a dysfunctional old piece of property into a thriving working farm. Allie was busy with running the general store and planning her wedding to Ben, and they dropped their near constant communication with each other. Allie couldn't even remember the last time she had sent Naomi a stupid joke text. Still, the kind of relationship they'd built over the years wouldn't just disappear. And neither would the 6 cents that bonded them. Naomi had been trying to distract herself from the looming ceremony, and Allie could tell that she was on the point of exhaustion trying to tackle all the work at the farm without any help. And every time she called Allie, the tiredness in her voice was clear. Naomi preferred to be in the middle of nowhere on her own, but Allie hated the idea of her best friend working herself to death. She brought up the idea of hiring help once, but Naomi had laughed it off with a cheery, "You know I hate being around people who aren't UALS." It was typical of Naomi. She knew what she wanted and she wouldn't stand for anyone telling her otherwise. Since she'd moved to Fell, Naomi had become more centered, more mature. Her days of recklessly driving cars on roads that would have given even Nikki lewd a pause and drinking everyone in the club under the table seemed to be behind her. She seemed to have become more fully herself. As much as Allie loved the loud, brash girl she'd grown up with, she loved this confident woman even more. Naomi seemed like she was at peace now, like she'd found her place. She no longer had to be so out there to carve out a place for herself in the world, and Allie was happy for her. But slowly, over the last couple of weeks, Allie found herself getting tenser, more anxious. Every random sound made her jump. Every unanswered text or missed call by Naomi and Ben put her on edge. Even that morning she'd woken up already a big ball of anxiety, and going to the office hadn't helped. She couldn't focus, and she found herself standing up from her chair, pacing back and forth until finally Ben got sick of it. He had grabbed her shoulders and steered her back to her desk chair. "You need to stop pacing and tell me what's wrong. I don't have it in the budget to replace this carpet when you wear a hole in it." He had perched on the edge of her desk and waited for her to answer. She had wanted to more than anything. Ben was the person who had helped her through all the challenges she had faced in life. But how could she explain these feelings? She didn't even understand them herself. "I'm sorry, honey," she had said. "I'll try to relax and get some work done. Go back to your desk. It's bad enough when one of us is being unproductive." She had turned back to her computer, but it was no good. In the end, she had settled for plugging in a set of earbuds and discreetly watching cat videos. It was Ben who had finally suggested that they go out to Naomi's farm to surprise her with dinner. "I just think you need to spend some non-stressful time together," he said. "She's been on edge all month and you've been worried about her all month. I'm making an executive decision that we're having dinner." Allie had raised one perfectly arched eyebrow. "Executive decision? Who died and elected you president?" Ben had kept his head bent over his paperwork. "At least then you'll see she's fine and you'll stop worrying," he had replied. But she had to admit he was right. Having dinner with Naomi would mean that she could at least check up on her best friend without unleashing a tirade of mockery over how overprotective she was. The term mother hen had been thrown at her more than once. She and Naomi needed some time to just be together as friends and hang out without thinking about the binding ceremony or worrying about what was going on in Sanguine. They hadn't had a proper celebration of Naomi's decision to join the Fell pack either. Two birds, one stone. Allie smiled to herself as she sat in the car on the way to the farm, with a bottle of wine and some take-out food in the back. Allie's stomach clenched and roiled. She shifted uncomfortably in her chair and fiddled with her seatbelt. "Are you okay?" Ben asked, gently patting her knee. "Yeah, I don't know. Just a little nervous, I guess." Ben frowned. "What's wrong?" Allie shrugged. "I have no idea. That's the problem. Nothing is actually wrong." But as she spoke, she knew that wasn't true. Her instincts were rarely wrong. Over the years she'd learned to trust them, and she was grateful for it. If she hadn't, she'd probably be dead right now. The events of the past year reared up in her mind, but she tried to ignore them as well as the wave of nausea they inevitably brought with them. It wasn't time for that now. She was going to spend time with her friend, not dwell on the past. Her instinct was wrong this time. It had to be. She took her cell phone and dialed Naomi's number. Voicemail. Allie shook her head as though to remove the anxiety from her head. She looked out of the window at the landscape whizzing past their car window and tried to swallow down the trepidation in her stomach. Nothing was wrong. Nothing was wrong. She kept repeating it to herself like a mantra. Nothing was wrong. Her father hadn't been heard from in months. Naomi was fine, and Ben's mother was finally starting to come around about the wedding. But at the back of her mind, the anxiety lurked. It was dusk by the time they got to the farm. The wind nipped through the window, stinging Allie's cheeks as she looked out at the fields. At least it snapped her out of her thoughts. The farmhouse loomed in the distance, dark and imposing. Allie's stomach turned over. She turned to Ben. "The lights aren't on. Do you think she's all right?" Ben put his hand back on her knee. "She's fine, I promise. What's got you so worried anyway?" Allie smiled and shrugged. "It's nothing. I'm being stupid. It's fine." She turned back to the view out of the window. The darkness of the farmhouse was really bothering her. She dialed Naomi's number again. Voicemail again. Something wasn't right. Something was definitely not right. The moment the car stopped in front of the house, she leaped out and headed to the front door, trying not to run. If Naomi was home, she'd never hear the end of it. Allie, calm down. She's fine. She's probably just busy or sleeping, Ben said, as he pulled the bags of takeout from the back seat. Allie kept knocking. There was a smell surrounding the farmhouse, something foreign and sharp. She sniffed at it as she waited for a response. It wasn't something she'd ever smelled here before, and it stood out like a thistle in a rosebush, making adrenaline flood through her body. Her hackles raised and she found herself knocking on the door even more frantically. No answer, asked Ben. Allie ignored him and ran to the side door. Locked. The back door was locked, too, but Allie could see through its window that there was no blinking light from the box just inside. The alarm hadn't been turned on. Allie knew that. Naomi was pretty lax about her security out here during the day, but she also knew that her best friend never failed to turn on the alarm when she turned in for the night. The air turned electric. Everything was quiet and still. Even the animals were silent as the grave. Allie ran back to Ben. She's not here. Something's happened to her. He looked as alert as she felt, turning his head this way and that, trying to sniff out what the new aroma on the farm meant. I think you're right, he said. His voice was low and heavy. Someone was here. He set the bags of food on the stairs and made his way around the back of the house to the main yard. Fear hung heavy in the air. Fear and anger. Allie breathed deep, letting the emotions flood through her. She'd much rather be angry than afraid, and it wasn't difficult to let it overtake her as they crept around her best friend's farm, knowing that someone had been here. The yard was dead silent. The sunflowers in the little flower bed drooped mournfully over the empty space. There was no sign of Naomi anywhere. The sunset cast long shadows on the ground, and the sinister black shapes raised the hairs on Allie's arms. Suddenly something caught her eye. There was a bucket lying on its side beside the water trough, scuffs in the dirt around it. Allie's hackles raised as she followed the marks to the middle of the yard. The scuffs continued out across the yard, turning into swooping lines leading towards the house. Allie's blood started to run cold as she followed the marks. They were undeniable marks of a fight. She knelt on the ground and peered at the dirt. From this close up she could see claw marks scratched into the soil, deep and desperate, next to a few droplets of something dark. Allie touched the tip of her finger to it and smelled blood. Naomi's. That smell had been seared into her brain last year. She blindly reached her hand out, trying to reach Ben. Thankfully he was right behind her and he grasped her suddenly cold hand with his own. Someone hurt her, she rasped. Ben knelt on the ground beside her. Allie, calm down. Maybe she just cut herself. But he didn't sound convinced by his own words as he touched the little drop of blood with the tip of his finger. She shook her head. She didn't cut herself, and you know it. Look at this mess. Someone hurt her. She frantically looked around for something. Anything. Naomi wasn't here, and there'd been a fight. The realization settled in her mind like a rock. Someone had taken her. Ben put his hand on her shoulder, but she shrugged it off. Her senses were so highly sensitized that even her fiancé's touch was almost painful. He settled for just sitting next to her, saying the exact thing that she was thinking. Someone has taken. Chapter 9. John. Once they got to Andre's cabin, Dimitri hopped out of the truck without looking back and headed inside, leaving John to take care of their prisoner. It wasn't a surprise. Dimitri had made it clear that the nuts and bolts of John's job. John didn't complain. It was better than being on the receiving end of Dimitri's rage. The cabin was in the forest, far enough away from the village proper that no one would be able to hear or see anything that went on up here. John didn't know why Andre wanted them to take Naomi somewhere so isolated, nor had he dared to ask, but he had ideas. Talk around Sanguine was that Andre's erratic moods and behaviors were getting worse these days. Apparently he spent his days ranting and raving in his house in the middle of town, even when no one else was there. The maids and housekeepers who worked for him were terrified by his behavior. They scuttled to and fro in the village, buying groceries and what looked like unreasonable amounts of cleaning supplies, their faces drawn and gray. Even The elders were worried, congregating in small groups around town, whispering behind their hands. The whole village had been plunged into an atmosphere of tension and fear, just like the old days under more barbaric alphas. The fact that he had what looked like a dedicated hostage storage cabin in the forest didn't make John feel any more confident in Andrei's leadership nor in Naomi's fate. Still, John and Dimitri had been paid for this job, and Dimitri never left his work undone. So John sighed and unloaded Naomi from the van as carefully as he could, trying to make sure he didn't jostle her too much. The blood flow coming from her head had slowed down, but the gash looked bright and angry against the red of her hair. Dimitri had shown him the cabin ahead of time to study its layout, so even with the lights off, John knew exactly where to go. He'd even come out here a couple of times to check and recheck the locks, study the perimeter, and examine everything else that could potentially cause security issues. All in all, the place seemed as secure as it could be for them to complete the job. At the back of the cabin there was a completely empty storage room with a door that had a deadbolt. It was like something out of a horror movie, and even John had been unsettled when he'd first seen it. The concrete walls were completely bare, unbroken even by the cracks that tended to run through concrete of a certain age. The room only had one window high up near the ceiling and only about the width of a paperback novel. Dimitri had given him an old blanket and a pillow to put in there, and John had laid them in the corner furthest from the door. It would make it easier to keep an eye on her later. Now, as he brought the girl inside and laid her on the blanket, the room looked even more sinister than before. Seeing her lying there on a blanket in an otherwise bare room, her face bruised from the fight on the farm, plucked at something deep inside of him that he'd always strived to keep hidden. He looked away, trying to keep himself from feeling sorry for her. It was what Dimitri had drilled into him from his first day here. This was a job, nothing more. Dimitri walked in, coils of rope in his arms. He tossed them at John. "Tie her up," he barked. John examined the rope. It was rough and white, and heavier than it looked. "Did you put silver in these ropes?" he asked. Dimitri nodded. "Just a little precaution. A little silver here and there, and we'll have her under our control." John's blood ran cold. Silver suppressed the shifting process. Everyone knew the stories of how to incapacitate a wolf, the horror stories of silver bullets and chains that were sometimes used to keep wolves captive. The wolf was a basic part of them, their most instinctive part, linking them to the natural world. Crippling that part was beyond cruel. He must have hesitated a little too long for Dimitri's liking, because the older wolf growled at him. "Don't start getting soft. This job is of the utmost importance." His voice echoed menacingly around the empty room. John flushed. He hadn't meant to make his discomfort that obvious, and it would cost him dearly, he knew that for sure. "Everything's taken care of," he replied, trying to sound confident. He tied up the girl's arms and legs with the ropes he'd been given. He could see them cutting into her skin, but he didn't want Dimitri to think he wasn't committed. She was lying there still as a rock. The blood on the back of her head was starting to clot, but it was still pooling on the blanket underneath her. That blow had hurt her worse than he'd intended. He made a mental note to find a dressing for her wound. He could justify it to Dimitri by saying he didn't want her to die before Andrei got his hands on her. Once she was as settled as she was going to be, he and Dimitri left her alone in the room, making sure to lock the door behind them. The girl wasn't going anywhere. "Nothing to do now but wait until Andrei gets here," said Dimitri. He fished a cigarette out of his pocket and lit up, slouching towards the front room. John glanced back at the door. "She'd be fine in there until they got back, right?" The two men went out into the front room. The place was Spartan at best. There were 3 chairs clustered around a stone fireplace, and a worn-out wooden table in the section of the room that would have served as the kitchen. Dimitri plopped heavily into one of the chairs in front of the fireplace and inhaled the cigarette smoke heavily. "When Andrei gets here, he and I have business to discuss," he said. "I'll leave with him. You'll stay here to take care of our guest." John nodded, trying to hide his trepidation. He'd been prepared for this. Dimitri had made it clear from the start that securing the girl was going to be his job. But now that she was here, lying unconscious in the other room, everything was starting to get very real. There was an actual person lying in there, and Dimitri and Andrei were almost definitely going to hurt her. And John was a part of the operation. He swallowed hard. What's wrong with you? Asked Dimitri. Nothing. Just trying to make sure I have everything ready. Dimitri looked at him suspiciously. Go check the perimeter, he said. I don't want anything left to chance. John nodded sharply and went outside. His eyesight was good enough that even in the fading light he could see everything around him. He walked around the cabin and then around the edge of the property, taking his time. They hadn't been followed from Fell, he was sure of that, but if someone noticed that Naomi had disappeared from her farm, Sanguine would be the first place they'd look. He just completed his second circuit around the property when he heard Dimitri whistling for him, and he headed back to the cabin. Dimitri was standing on the porch with a face like thunder, cell phone in hand, waiting for John to get back. Andre wants to meet at his place. I'm taking the truck, so get your stuff out of there, he ordered. John hurried to comply. Dimitri was already irritated with him, and John didn't want to go fishing for a punishment. He hauled the bags he packed out of the van and dropped them on the porch. It was a pretty drastic change to the plan. Andre was supposed to meet them at the cabin and finish up the payment with Dimitri, and then this whole thing would be over. But if Andre wasn't coming to meet them at the cabin, then the plan had changed. The thought unsettled him. John liked knowing things for sure. He liked it when everything went according to plan. That was why he spent so much time trying to prepare things. Dimitri watched him as he worked, puffing on his cigarette. His expression was inscrutable. As soon as John finished, Dimitri extinguished his cigarette on the porch railing. I won't be back tonight, he said. You're on your own. Follow the plan. Make sure nothing goes wrong. I will, said John. I want to check on the girl before I leave, Dimitri said, then turned on his heel and walked inside. Dimitri's attitude was making John nervous. Something must have happened, and John knew that Dimitri was going to take it out on him later. That was so often the case when you were working for Dimitri. Someone would make Dimitri angry, and he'd take it out on whoever happened to be closest to him. John straightened his back as he followed his boss into the cabin. Chapter 10. Naomi. The first thing Naomi felt when she woke up was pain. Searing, pulsing pain. It flooded through her like water, forcing a wave of nausea up her throat. She swallowed thickly. Her mouth tasted like pennies. She took a couple of deep breaths to calm her stomach. It felt like the worst of the pain was coming from the back of her head. Her eyes instinctively scrunched closed as the wave of pain crested again and hit her again, harder, stronger. She took another deep breath. Her head felt like it was stuffed with cotton. Something had happened to her. Something bad, and now she was hurt and lying on the ground somewhere on what felt like a thin blanket. She had to figure out what was going on so she could get help, but her thoughts were forming as slowly as molasses. She'd fed the animals. Had she tripped on something? Hit her head on the fence or on a piece of farm equipment? Her memory was a complete blank. She carefully opened her eyes. She might as well have kept them closed. Everything was pitch black. Her heart started to race, the sick beating making the gorge rise in her throat again. She blinked a couple of times. Had she hit herself hard enough to go blind? Everything around here seemed to be just gone, even though she could feel that her eyes were open. Desperation rose like a specter in her mind. What the hell was going on? She breathed hard, trying to quell the panic cutting through her. Now wasn't the time to panic. First things first. She had to know how badly she'd been hurt. Her body ached so much and it hurt to move, but she tried anyway. Her arms wouldn't move an inch though. They stayed glued by her side. The panic took over. She struggled, turned and tossed, trying to make her arms and legs do something. Anything to move, to go get help. Tears started flowing freely from her eyes, and sharp cries tore from her with each attempt to make her body do something. Finally, spent and exhausted, lying on the blanket on the cold, hard ground, Naomi came to the second big realization since she'd woken up. Her arms and legs weren't paralyzed. Someone had tied her up, pretty securely at that. She could feel it now that she was still, the coarse rope rubbing against her skin. The dam broke. Tears flooded down Naomi's face like a river. Her breath started tearing out of her chest with desperation, fighting against the pain that was suddenly closing around her heart and lungs. Her hands curled into fists so tight her nails cut into her tingling palms. The darkness closed around her like a blanket being drawn over her head. She couldn't see anything, couldn't smell anything, but her mind and body united in one instinct. She had to get out of here. Her body cried out to transform, but she couldn't make it no matter how she tried. She strained and struggled, willing her body to change, willing her animal side to take over. It didn't help. Her binds chafed against her fevered skin, but she felt something cool there too. A chilling thought popped into her head. There were not many things that could stop a wolf from transforming. If it wanted to, the exception being silver. No one really knew how it worked. But silver could bind a wolf in whatever form they were in. If whoever tied her up had put silver in the ropes, they disabled her completely. That also meant that her captors were pretty much the definition of evil. Doing that to a wolf needed such a lack of ethic and such a depth of cruelty that even Andre hadn't done it to his daughter when he was trying to force her into marriage. Finally, her strength gave out, and she let herself fall back on the blanket. Her whole body heaved with sobs, all hope drained out of her. She couldn't even shift. How could she protect herself? The horror of it all settled around her heart. She was tied up, injured, and all alone in the dark. Naomi didn't know how much time passed. There was no way to tell here in the dark. She must have fallen asleep because she was suddenly awoken by a blinding white light. She instinctively closed her eyes immediately to protect them from the burning light. Something creaked loudly, and it took her a minute to realize that the light was coming from a door opening. Someone was coming in. She kept her eyes closed. "Well, looks like our guest is awake," said a man's voice. Naomi's stomach dropped. She kept her body as still as she could. If the man thought she was asleep, maybe he'd say something useful. If she couldn't defend herself by shifting, she could at least learn what he wanted from her. Took all her strength to keep control of herself. She'd never felt such visceral fear before. The room had filled with a smell that she couldn't place, but it was making every cell in her body shout, "Danger!" "I don't think so," said another voice. "She's pretty still." Naomi peeked up from under her eyelashes. The light was not as harsh this time as she acclimated to it, but she had trouble making out who was speaking. There was a large black silhouette not far from where she was lying. It stood immobile for a while, then split into two. The two figures were standing in a doorway leading into the bare, concrete-walled room where she was lying. One of the figures in the doorway walked into the room right up to her and squatted down. His broad shoulders blocked out the light. She closed her eyes all the way, praying he wouldn't notice that she was awake. He put his face right up to hers. She had to force herself not to flinch away from his breath, which smelled of gore like a hyena's. "I think someone is playing with us," he hissed. He poked her with one finger, as if she were a piece of garbage. "It's all right. Let her pretend for a few more minutes. We have all the time in the world." He laughed as he walked away from her. The men stepped out of the room and closed the door, leaving her in complete darkness again. She could hear them talking to each other on the other side of the door. Her blood rushed loudly in her ears. She had been right. Someone had taken her. Why though? She didn't have money, she didn't have rich connections who would pay for her freedom. She wouldn't be useful in any way. She started struggling again, fighting to get out of her bonds. But no matter how hard she tried, no matter how strong she knew she was, there was no give in her ties. Suddenly, the door creaked open again. "I'm going to turn on the light, so you might want to close your eyes." The voice belonged to the second man, the one who had stayed by the door before. Naomi bristled. So even though she was tied up and lying on the ground, this guy had the audacity to tell her to close her eyes from the light like he was a good guy? He flicked on the light, and she flinched but kept her eyes open. She didn't care if he saw her awake now. Anger was overtaking her fear. The man carefully closed the door behind him and came into the room. He was a tall man, well built. He was dressed in all black from head to toe, and when he turned around she saw that he was relatively young. He knelt beside her and grabbed her by the shoulders. Her anger boiled over. She turned her head this way and that, trying to get at him in the only way she could now, with her teeth. He didn't seem fazed at Al and just hauled her up into a sitting position like she was no more than a rag doll. Her whole body ached and she couldn't suppress a grimace. Her head was pounding. The man shoved her against the wall behind her, not so much as a rough gesture, but as if to make her stay where she was. Who the hell are you? She spit. Her head was starting to spin, but she wasn't going to let him know that. His expression didn't change. You have a head injury. How do you feel? He asked. There was no emotion in his voice. He might as well have been reading from a phone book. How do I feel? What kind of question is that? Who are you? She yelled. She could barely keep her eyes open, her head hurt so much. But she was not weak. She wouldn't let him see how hurt she was. He reached for her head, but she flinched away from him. He paid her no attention. He was close enough now that she could properly see him. He had a scar running down one side of his face, and it jogged a vague memory. She tried to grasp onto it, but it was just out of reach. He ran his hand over the back of her head, and with a shock she realized that he was checking her for any injuries. There was a swift and light movement of fingers on skin, an insistent pressure. He reached the place where she'd been hurt and pressed down on it, almost making her pass out. He mumbled a quiet, sorry in response to her sharp cry and then reached into his pocket, pulling out a roll of gauze and some kind of pad in a plastic wrapping. He ripped the plastic package open with his teeth and held the pad against her wound with one hand as he unfurled the gauze and struggled to wrap it around her head with the other. He finally managed it and tied the gauze securely. Her head was throbbing from the pressure of the dressing and the gauze, but at least her wound was protected from dirt now. She narrowed her eyes as she looked at the man. If he was treating her injury, then he wanted to keep her alive, which meant that they wanted something from her. When he finally finished seeing to her injury, he sat back on the ground and looked closely at her. She smarted under his scrutiny. What are you looking at? She snapped. The scent of him was strangely familiar, and it tugged at her memory. An image of the farm popped into her mind, the animals milling around their feeding trough. She remembered putting them up for the night and then walking out into the yard. Everything after that was just beyond her reach. Whoever this man was, her basic instinct was screaming at her to leap at him and rip out his throat. You know, being hostile isn't going to help anyone, he said. His face was very still, like he'd practiced not showing any expressions on it. It was strange. Now, do you know what day it is? Of course I don't, she yelled. I don't even know who you are. Everything will be explained later. But you have to be checked over first, he said. Can you tell me your name? He leaned in closer and stared into her eyes, shielding them from the ceiling light and then letting it shine on them. She realized with hazy surprise that he was checking her pupil reflexes. The anger started to drain out of her, only to be replaced with a cotton-like fog in her brain. All she wanted was to close her eyes and go to sleep, but at the same time that seemed like the most dangerous thing in the world. Naomi Grimes, she replied defiantly. You should remember it. It'll be the last thought you have when I get out of here and rip your throat out. The edges of her vision started to blur. She blinked once, twice. Didn't help much. The man sat back on his haunches with a huff. You need to stay calm, he said. You don't want to make your injury worse. For the first time since he'd come into the room, his expression changed slightly, though she couldn't place what it meant. Since her anger wasn't making any difference to the stone-faced man, she decided to change tacks. Look, forget everything else. I just want to know where I am and who you are. I'm assuming you're the one who hit me in the head, so it's the least you can do. Since you tried to brain me, and all. She tried to keep her tone friendly and even. Shouting wasn't going to help her. And her head was hurting too much for her to even comfortably try it. The man's eyes flicked towards the door as if he was afraid that they would be overheard. It was the only sign of humanity he'd shown so far, and Naomi jumped on it. Please, she said, trying to make her voice sound appropriately weak and plaintive. I don't even know where I am. Can't you at least tell me that? I can't hurt you. You guys made sure of that. She gave her arms a shake. Please. The crack in her voice was accidental, but it added to the effect. It worked. You're insanguine. That's all I can tell you, he said. You'll know the rest soon enough. They'll want to tell you themselves. They? Who's they? I can't tell you anymore, he said. He heaved his bulk to his feet and walked back to the door. It creaked unbearably loudly as he opened it, and Naomi knew she had just one more chance to make him change his mind before he left her again. Come on, please just tell me what this is about. If it's about money I have it, she pleaded, lying through her teeth. If you let me go, I can give you any amount you want. I can make sure you're protected. I have friends who can make sure you don't get in trouble. The man paused in his steps and glanced back at her. This time she could tell what the expression on his face was: sorrow. He licked his lips as he thought of what to say. I'm sorry about your head, he said. Then he turned on his heel and left the room, turning off the overhead light. As Naomi was plunged into darkness again, she finally let her eyes close. Chapter 11. Allie. No matter how long Allie and Ben searched or how they all but turned the farm upside down, it yielded no more clues about where Naomi could have gone. Thanks to Ben's misspent youth, getting through the lock on the back door was a matter of seconds. But the house was still and empty inside. There were no signs of trouble in there, just a couple of cups on the kitchen table and a blanket tossed on the couch, along with Naomi's phone. Outside, besides the droplets of blood and the scuffs in the dirt, which Ben made sure to take pictures of, the only clue was that strange smell hanging in the air. Ben took another deep smell of it and frowned. What is it? Do you recognize the smell? Allie asked. But Ben just shook his head. I just can't put my finger on it, he said. Just for something to do, they next called the local hospitals. But no one by Naomi's name or description had come in. Finally, defeated, they drove back to town at a speed that would have made Naomi very proud and headed straight for Rex's house, only to find that he wasn't home. The housekeeper begrudgingly told them he'd be back the next morning and closed the door in their faces. Allie nearly burst into tears on the spot. Ben, just as frustrated, kicked one of the ornamental stone plant pots on the porch. If Rex was out of town, it would mean God knew how many hours before they could start a proper search. And since Naomi wasn't a full member of the pack yet, the elders probably wouldn't approve a proper search and rescue. We can't just stand here, Allie cried. What can we do? What can we do? Without Rex, we have to do something. She knew she sounded hysterical, and she felt it. Her whole body thrummed with energy that needed to go somewhere. And without something to do, she felt like she was going to burst. She grabbed the car keys from Ben's hand and strode back to the car, without really knowing where she was going to go. Ben followed her down the front stairs, but he might as well have not been there. Allie was suddenly laser-focused. Already in her mind she was going through a list of the places Naomi frequented that she could search. There was the boutique, whose owner bought wool from the farm for bespoke crafts. There was the diner, the library, the bookstore, and the antique store. Frantic laugh ripped from her throat as she thought of how Fell had sanded off Naomi's rough edges. Old Naomi would have died at the thought of spending any amount of time in an antique store. Ben finally caught up with her and put a hand on her shoulder to try to calm her. Honey, you have to calm down. You can't help her if you drive off without a plan. She whirled around to face him. Don't tell me to calm down. How am I supposed to do that? My best friend is missing. The one person who can help us isn't home, and I don't know what to do. She flung the door of the car open and climbed into the driver's seat. All she wanted to do was find Naomi, see her, and talk to her. Her best friend's face swam before her eyes, and suddenly all the emotions of the past couple of hours broke free. She dropped her head onto the steering wheel and cried. Ben rushed to her side and pulled her to him. He held her as she cried, his own heart mirroring the frantic beat of her own. Knowing that he was just as invested in finding Naomi as she was eased her despair a little. There had been times when she had felt like Naomi and Ben might actually hate each other, when their playful banter took on the slight edge of buried resentments. But holding her fiancé now, she knew better. Ben was here to help her. He'd done it before, and he'd do it again. The thought almost made her believe that everything would be okay. Finally, Ben gently lifted Allie's head from his shoulder and kissed her tenderly, more to reaffirm their connection than anything else. Allie, I'm just as worried about her as you are, he said, stroking her hair. But we have to try to be smart about this. The housekeeper said that Rex would be back in the morning, right? So maybe we should try to cover the places they'd look first, like the places in town she might be. That way Rex won't have to start from scratch. Allie nodded in agreement. I'm sorry for yelling before, she whispered. Ben smiled and softly chucked her under her chin. If you can't yell at me, Who can you yell at, baby? He said. She smiled and held him tighter. I'm sorry. I shouldn't yell at all. I'm just on edge. She's gone, and we have no idea where she could be. What if she trailed off, leaving the thought unspoken? What if it was Andre who had taken her? What if he wanted to use Naomi to get to Allie? Ice closed around her heart as the thought occurred to her, but she tried her best to dismiss it. Allie hadn't heard from Andre in a year. No one had. Rex had mentioned to her that he thought the Sanguines were going to ground trying to regroup, but Andre wouldn't do something like this. It was too crass. If he did come after one of them, Allie had always feared it would be Ben. Was he going to be next? She held him tighter, her hands curling into fists. The couple fell silent, each instinctively understanding the other's fears. Then they released each other, clear on what to do, but none of the places they went to next held any clues as to where Naomi could be. She was nowhere to be seen. It was as though she'd vanished into thin air. Allie had no more ideas on what to do, feeling herself fall into despair again. Why don't we go and see Alan? Ben suggested, keeping a cool head. If Rex can't help us, then Alan is the next best thing. He might be able to help. Allie nodded and let Ben do the driving up to Alan's house. When they got there, Alan opened the door for them himself. He was a man who valued privacy and had decided a long time ago that he didn't need any live-in domestic staff. He hated people in his space, as he'd once told Allie. Alexandra, Benjamin. How nice to see you, Alan said, his patrician voice steady even in the face of his disheveled guests. He didn't seem to mind the late hour at all. He stood back to let them into the well-appointed foyer. Allie felt herself start to calm down as she walked into the cool, dimly lit space, but she still had no patience for small talk. Naomi's gone, she blurted. We think someone's taken her. Alan frowned. Come through to the study, he said, unflappable as ever. He led them into a cozy study, decked out in leather armchairs and tartan fabric. He settled on the large wingback chair by the fireplace and waited until Allie and Ben sat down before continuing. Tell me the story from the beginning, he said, looking at the two of them over the top of his glasses. Allie looked at Ben. She couldn't tell this story, not so soon. Thankfully, he understood just as well as he always did. He turned to Alan and told him the whole story, how they went to the farm to surprise Naomi, and how they found everything abandoned, right down to the scuff marks and the blood drops on the ground. Alan just listened in that sage, grandfatherly way he had about him. He didn't say a word, even after Ben was finished, letting a heavy silence linger between the three of them. Finally he spoke. Perhaps she hurt herself and went to the hospital, he said. That's where the blood drops could have come from. Allie had difficulty not rolling her eyes. We called the hospitals. No one's seen her, she said. Alan looked at her curiously. All right, good that you checked that. But how do we know it wasn't an innocent accident with a customer? We have to check all avenues before we start jumping to conclusions, Alexandra. His use of her first name grated on Allie's nerves more than anything she'd heard all day. She normally didn't mind it, but now it sounded so paternal and condescending. She wanted to leap across the carpet and slap some sense into him. We've checked everything we could possibly check, she said. Alan, I'm sure of it. There's no way that something didn't happen to her. Alan said, letting another long silence expand itself between them. Well, have you informed the police? Perhaps they can help you find her. Allie flushed. Whoever took her is a wolf. The police won't be of much use. There was just as much truth as frustration in that statement. Why wouldn't Alan understand the gravity of the situation? Have you checked the places she frequents? Of course we have, but she's nowhere to be found, Allie replied. She tried to stay calm and speak respectfully, but the man was getting on her last nerve. Listen, Alan, we need your help. We need to put together a search party or something, or call the other packs in the area. Maybe they've seen or heard something. Alan's face took on a curious expression that Allie couldn't read. He bowed his head for a minute, thinking. When he finally spoke, he sounded like he was choosing his words with care. Alexandra, organizing an official search party is difficult. Naomi is a valued member of our community, but she isn't officially part of the pack yet. It was hard enough getting the elders to hear her case, but you should be prepared for the possibility that they will not be willing to authorize an official search using PAC resources. Allie's face burned. Can't Rex overrule them? She asked. He should be back soon. Maybe he can make them see sense. Ellen shrugged. I'll call him and ask for a meeting. He walked out of the study, leaving Allie and Ben alone. Ben had been silent for a long time. I don't like this, Al. Maybe we should start thinking about other options. Allie was confused. What do you mean? Ben took her hand. I don't think they're going to help us, he said. He squeezed her hand reassuringly, but it didn't do anything for her. What are you talking about? I mean that Rex isn't going to overrule the elders. They're not going to let us set up an official investigation. Allie pulled her hand away. So you're saying we should give up? I'm saying maybe we're in this alone, he replied. Allie could hear Alan in the other room talking to Rex. She couldn't make out any words, but she knew from the tone that he wasn't nearly as calm as he had seemed before. They seemed to be in some kind of heated discussion, which might be an indication that this was not going to be an easy decision. Ben was probably right. Allie thought back to the situation she was in a year ago, being a prisoner of her own parents, waiting to be married off to a maniac. Ben and Naomi had swept in like the cavalry without waiting for official help, and had saved her from her father's machinations. She could do the same for Naomi now. One of the best things about being in such a long relationship with Ben was that they had learned to read each other like a couple of magazines. She looked at him with a small smile on her face, and she knew instantly that he knew exactly what she was thinking. Alan strode back into the study. Rex is on his way back. I've appraised him of the situation, and he is going to call a meeting with the elders. He sat back down in the wingback chair and leaned towards Allie. Alexandra, I understand your frustrations more than anyone, but we do things this way for a reason. Allie sighed. I get it, Alan, but we have to take action now. The longer she's gone, the less chance we have of getting her back. You know that. She stood up and started putting her coat on. Ben took her cue and stood up as well. We will let you know how everything goes, said Alan as he escorted them out. But in the meantime, please try not to worry too much. I'm sure Naomi is all right. She's a very capable woman. She can handle herself in any situation. He couldn't have brushed them off any clearer than that. Allie and Ben silently headed off to their car. Alan hadn't baldly turned down their request for help, but he might as well have, and the weight of it hung over them. They drove home in silence, both trying to figure out their next move. There was a very small chance that Rex would come through for them and somehow manage to convince the elders to help them find Naomi. But even if he did, they didn't know who had her. There had been no ransom demands or letters or anything. The situation was looking blacker and blacker by the minute. When they finally got home, Allie stomped to the bedroom and ripped her clothes off, flinging them this way and that without regard for where they landed, and then flung herself on the bed. Ben joined her a few moments later, and they both lay there staring at the ceiling. What do we do now? Asked Allie. Ben curled protectively around her. We're going to wait to hear from Rex. Then, when he turns us down, we're going to make a plan and we're going to find her. That easy, she replied, running a hand through his hair, savoring the feeling of having this man who was so precious to her lying this close. Ben smiled and kissed her gently. It's that easy, baby. Eventually, they drifted off to sleep, the exhaustion finally seeping through them. The night passed quickly, and by the time they woke up, it was morning. Allie immediately checked her phone. There was a text from Rex. She elbowed Ben awake and groaned as she sat up. Her whole body ached and her eyes took a moment to adjust to the light. I have to talk to you guys. I'll be by first thing in the morning. What's going on? Ben groaned as he rubbed his eyes. Rex is on his way over, Allie replied, climbing out of bed and pulling on yesterday's clothes. Her response galvanized him into action, and he jumped out of bed to get dressed too. Allie raked her fingers through her hair to put it in some kind of order. She didn't want Rex to see her looking disheveled. They both rushed through their routines and hurried downstairs. They didn't have to wait long for him to turn up. Rex drove up their drive-in. A small white car, a far cry from his usual black SUV. Ben opened the door. Before Rex could even knock, Allie at his side. Ben, hey, said Rex. He looked tired. His usually immaculate hair was ruffled. and there were pronounced dark circles under his eyes. "Good morning, Rex. Come in. Can I get you some coffee?" Ben asked. Rex shook his head. "I can't stay." He turned to Allie. "I'm so sorry about. What happened? Have you heard anything new?" Allie shook her head, willing him to just get to the point. He sensed her hurry and continued. "I just came to tell you about the meeting last night." Allie nodded, waiting for the news she knew was coming. A tiny irrational part of her hoped that the elders would surprise her and help find Naomi. The rest of her was just waiting for confirmation of what she and Ben had known all along. Rex's face confirmed that they hadn't been wrong. "Guys, I'm sorry, but they don't want to use pack assets to find a loner. I tried. I really did. Half of them wanted to help, but without a unanimous vote, there's nothing I can do. Without a ransom demand or a note or anything, a lot of them think she just left." Allie's frustration finally bubbled over. "That's not what happened," she shouted. "We were at the farm. There was blood on the ground. Rex, she didn't leave. She was taken." Rex looked pained. "Allie, I believe you, I do, but I can't go against them. It's complicated." "I'm sorry." Ben pulled Allie towards him, as much to comfort her as to calm her down. "Isn't there anything you can do to help us?" he asked Rex. He reached out and put a hand on Allie's elbow. "Just because I can't help you as a pack leader doesn't mean I can't help you at all. I know you two are thinking of trying to find her yourselves, so if you need information or anything, let me know." He turned to leave, but just as he touched the doorknob, he paused. "I really am sorry. You know how much I like her, and I hope you find some way to help her." With that, he turned around and hurried back to his car. Allie and Ben stood quietly in the foyer for a few minutes. They'd known this would be the outcome, but it was still a heavy blow. Finally, Allie turned to Ben. "It'll be just that easy, baby, right?" Ben smiled. "Just that easy.